It's a real pleasure for me and my colleagues at Unite to be the premier sponsor supporting Universities UK this year with its conference. Now, Unite Group is the UK's largest provider of student accommodation. We have 42,000 rooms across the UK. So it will probably come as little surprise to you that under the banner of that somewhat long title for my presentation today, there is very much an accommodation theme. But I think it's a theme that fits well with the broader theme of the conference over the next couple of days. What I'd like to share some thoughts with you about is where does student accommodation fit, or where should it fit on the strategic agenda for leaders of universities today at a time of so much more broader change. And so in the context of boundaries and a world without boundaries, I think the boundary I'm really exploring there is how the boundary between the university sector and the private sector, in the accommodation specifically, has changed over recent years, and doubtless how it will continue to change in the coming years. What I'd like to do first of all is just to give you and share a little bit of background about the private student accommodation sector, because it's a sector which has grown incredibly quickly over the past 20 or so years. If I had been talking to you 20 years ago, notwithstanding the fact it would have been kind of an unfeasibly young person to be presenting to you 20 years ago, I wouldn't have had anything really to talk about, because in the early 1990s, this sector simply didn't exist. But as of today, only 20 years later, there are approximately 165,000 bedrooms across the UK provided by private companies such as Unite throughout 20 to 30 different cities across that period. And that's all happened in that 20-year period of time. Now, to put that in the context of the broader university sector, there are around 320,000 rooms that are owned and operated by universities. So as of today, a third of students who are living in purpose-built accommodation are living not with the universities, but with private landlords. So that must have a bearing on how we think about student accommodation as part of the broader student experience. And it's grown incredibly quickly over that 20-year period. Those 165,000 rooms equates to something like £10 billion worth of investment, most of which has been within the last decade. But it isn't a sector that has stopped growing. That growth is all down to the well-understood, I think, themes of student number growth over that same period of time: demographics, government policy, international student demand. But it will continue to grow, and there are approximately 30,000 additional rooms that are going to be built over the next 3 to 4 years. So pretty quickly, there are 200,000 privately operated student bedrooms across the UK, so over 40% of the provision. Now, where does Unite fit into that sector? Well, we have 42,000 rooms, so we represent a quarter of that private sector. And that represents about 4% of all students living anywhere when studying at university. We're the largest because of those numbers there, but we're also the oldest. We're celebrating our 21st, so we're young, of course, by university standards, but celebrating our 21st anniversary this year. So we've seen quite a bit happen over that period of time. And we're operating in 24 different cities, and we have relationships, active relationships, partnerships with over 70 institutions across those cities within the UK. And what I'd like to just explore in a little bit more detail are two, what I think are important strategic themes, certainly for us as a business and as a sector for student accommodation, but I think for a number of universities as well. The first theme over the next 5 to 10 years is, with so many students living in privately operated accommodation, we, the private sector and universities, need to be proactive in being partners in the student experience. And I'll come on and talk about that in more detail in a moment and how we're thinking about that. But secondly, with that growth over such a rapid period of time, there is an enormous amount of investment into the sector that now understands the sector. There is an increasingly deep pool of capital interested in and prepared to invest in significant ways into the sector. And at a time when financing and capital is on everyone's agenda, that must be a relevant consideration in thinking about the future direction of a university over the next decade. So taking the first of those and the partnership being partners in the student experience, well, why is that important? Well, I think on one level, it is simply a statement of fact. I think that would be to understate it, but it is simply a statement of fact. If there are, or there will be in 2 to 3 years' time, 200,000 students living in privately operated student accommodation, spending more time in and around their accommodation than anywhere else, generally speaking, during their university life, that must have a bearing on the experience they have of universities, whether we like it or not. But I think that would, as I say, understate the importance of it. For us, increasingly as a business, what we want to be seen as is distinctive for the accommodation that we provide and valued by the customers, the students to whom we provide that accommodation. And there must therefore be parallels to universities who themselves want to be increasingly distinctive about what they offer to students in increasingly competitive and global world. So there must be an opportunity, not just a necessity, but an opportunity to work together in thinking about that student experience and where accommodation fits in. Now, in terms of what can we bring, and I'll keep this specific in terms of Unite, but I think this equally would apply more broadly across the sector to our competitors as well. Well, I think at the highest level, what we can bring is experience, research and insight from working with 42,000 students across the UK, 70 plus different institutions. I'm not going to pretend for a moment that those are 70 fantastic, sparkling relationships who think we are the best thing that's ever happened to student accommodation. But I can assure you we have seen an enormous number of things that ought to work well, not work particularly well, and equally we've seen things that we would be surprised if they were going to work incredibly well. We have huge amounts of data, we do huge amounts of research with our students, as I know all universities do. So we increasingly understand what different segments of the student population are telling us they're looking for in terms of their accommodation. And you will know this more than any other audience, of course, but it is not a one-size-fits-all approach in terms of what students are looking for. 2/3 of our customers are either first years or international. And the international component of that is growing incredibly quickly. 47% of our total customer base is coming from outside of the UK, and 2/3 of that from outside of the European Union. Those international students, of course, have different demands of accommodation to UK or indeed EU students. So we're seeing more and more things from one year to the next, which what I think we haven't been good enough as a business or as a sector at the moment is sharing that insight with universities in the hope of also getting insight back from universities so that collectively we can improve the experience that students have at university and the accommodation element of that in particular. Now the two biggest opportunities, or the biggest opportunity, the biggest barrier, depending on which way you want to look at that, is how we go about integrating our approach to assessing and delivering a student experience with the differing approaches of different universities. And where that's probably most pronounced at the moment is in the area of student welfare. If there are so many students living in the private sector rather than within universities, then how do we make sure that students who need access to the welfare infrastructure of a university are able to get that quickly and easily if they're living with us? And indeed, how can people working for us be trained and adequately equipped to understand where a student may need some support but not be prepared or particularly inclined to ask for it? And so what we're doing for the first time this year is partnering with 3 of our institutions, institutional partners, to pilot an integrated approach to student welfare targeted at our residents. And that's working not only with the universities, but also with the local student unions. And on the assumption that works well, or we learn elements from that to be able to refine it and roll it out further, I would like to see that as a key feature of how we distinguish ourselves as an accommodation partner. Related to that, we've rolled out this year some pilots of encouraging our residents to be involved in local volunteering. Employability is an increasingly significant theme for students and for universities. And for us, we work hard, increasingly hard, to help students integrate with local communities. There are relatively few people who enjoy the prospect of having 400 students living on their doorstep. So actually acting proactively to help the integration with that local community is something that we can very positively do. And we've had enormously positive responses to that from our student customers over the past few months. So those are just a couple of small examples, but I think what they do begin to demonstrate is that by working more closely in partnership, we can collectively deliver a more positive experience for students, and that must be a good thing within the increasingly competitive world that we're operating. Moving to my second key theme for the next 5 to 10 years is the area of capital and the increasingly deep pools of capital that are aware of student accommodation as a sector. And let me just expand on what I mean by that a little bit more, because I'm very conscious that with something of a finance background in my history, I can slip too easily into jargon in this type of area. But fundamentally, over the last 20 years, we have seen an explosion in a number of sources of capital, of investors, both in terms of providing equity, but also lending to the sector, providing debt. So as things stand today, pretty much every UK pension fund, life fund, insurance company will have some exposure to student accommodation as an investment. Pretty much every single one. 20 years ago, effectively none had any exposure. Private investors, through their own pension funds, their SIPs, etc., they will increasingly have options to have exposure to student accommodation. Pretty much every major private equity name globally has some exposure to student accommodation, either within the UK, within the US, or increasingly within certain emerging markets. We ourselves have two very substantial investor relationships, one with the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Singapore and another with the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Bahrain. And so sovereign wealth funds, we're seeing state pension funds from the US also looking to invest within the UK as well as elsewhere across the world. And this has all developed really within the last 5 to 10 years in particular. And on the lending side, we've gone from a situation where we've had banks and more banks lending lots of money to a situation where there are decidedly fewer banks in a position to lend money, but an increasingly large number of other sources that have come in to take their place. So we've seen insurance companies start to provide debt facilities secured on portfolios of student accommodation. We've seen US insurance companies, bond investors, corporate bonds, whether it's in the UK or the US, have got exposure to student accommodation within the UK. It won't be very long before we will see retail bonds have some sort of exposure to bond instruments within the student accommodation space. These are all new sources of capital that have come into the sector in recent years that must be taken account of when we, or the university sector more widely, is thinking about how can different elements of operations be funded going forward. And one of the most interesting features from my perspective of that capital is it's what I would call genuine risk capital. It's people who are investing and prepared to take risk on the demand profile. The stuff we've just heard about in the previous presentation is something that they will of course be eager to understand more about. But fundamentally, people have got comfortable with the structural demand for UK higher education and therefore accommodation as one of the few ways of getting a genuine investment exposure into that sector. And what is it that attracts them? Well, it really is that stability. 60% of our portfolio is owned in a fund called the Unite Student Accommodation Fund. It is a unit trust. The investors alongside us are local authority pension funds, institutional investors. USS is a significant cornerstone investor within that. There's over 700 million of equity invested within that sector. It was the #1 performing fund for the last 5 years in the UK property sector. Not just in a specific part of the UK property sector, the entire UK property sector. Investors have taken notice of that and are keen to invest more capital within that sector. And that performance was not driven by rents being driven extremely high every year. It was driven by high occupancy every year and steady inflationary growth. That is what investors are increasingly looking for. So when you and finance directors are thinking about how different parts of the university operations can be financed, this is an increasingly viable but increasingly sophisticated pool of capital that I would encourage you to think about, and it's certainly something that we, of course, are thinking very carefully about ourselves. So I think in just trying to pull those themes together, those brief themes, I think we have seen over the past 20 years and accelerating in the last 5 to 10 years, fewer boundaries and less distinctive boundaries between higher education and the private sector. And accommodation, I think, is probably now the area where the student experience is more reliant on partnership with the private sector than any other element of what a university is delivering. So strategically, that has to be on the agenda. In terms of what it means for Unite and where I would like our business to be over the next 5 to 10 years, I would like us to be taking advantage of our track record, experience and knowledge of where to raise capital and how to finance student accommodation, but increasingly linking that directly to our increasing depth of understanding of the role that we and other operators can and need to play in delivering a truly valuable student experience. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you briefly.